Hamlet is the most quoted single piece of writing in the English language outside the King James Bible. There are more lines from Hamlet in everyday English speech than from any other play, novel, poem, or speech ever written. To be or not to be. The lady doth protest too much. There are more things in heaven and earth. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Frailty, thy name is woman. Brevity is the soul of wit. The play's the thing. To thine own self be true. We pronounce these lines without remembering, most of the time, that they came from a play. They have entered the language at the level of folk wisdom. And the play that produced them has been performed continuously, somewhere on earth, every year since approximately 1601. That is not an accident. That is not because Hamlet is a beautiful play, although it is. It is because Hamlet is the first piece of writing in Western literature in which a character thinks the way a modern reader thinks. Before Hamlet, no character in any play or novel had ever soliloquized in the modern sense, that is, had ever stood on a stage alone and not addressed the audience, and not addressed God, and not even, really, addressed himself, but had simply allowed the audience to listen in on the private working of his mind, in real time, as the mind argued with itself, doubled back, contradicted, reconsidered, and changed direction. Hamlet was the first character in literature whose interior was visible. Every protagonist in every novel since 1601, every novel you have ever read, every film with a brooding lead, every podcast monologue about indecision, descends from him. This is not a hyperbolic claim. It is the consensus, painstakingly arrived at, of 400 years of literary criticism. The American critic Harold Bloom titled his book on Shakespeare The Invention of the Human, and he argued, in 500 pages, that what Shakespeare specifically invented, in Hamlet specifically, was the modern interior self. The German philosopher Hegel said the same thing in different language. T.S. Eliot, who hated the play, said it anyway. The list of writers who have located in Hamlet the moment when literature began to do something it had never done before is long and is unanimous. This is an essay about what that thing is. And about why, 400 years later, every reader still recognizes themselves in it. To understand what is new about Hamlet, you have to understand what came before. The Greek tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles, written 2,000 years before Shakespeare, did not include private interior speech. The characters spoke aloud to other characters or to a chorus. When they were alone, they addressed the gods. There was no equivalent of what we now call interior monologue. Medieval mystery plays had no interior monologue either. Renaissance Italian plays did not. The English plays that immediately preceded Shakespeare, Marlowe's Tamburlaine, Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy, had soliloquies, yes, but the soliloquies were rhetorical declarations addressed at the audience. The character would explain, in metered verse, what he was about to do and why. The audience would receive the information. The plot would proceed. Hamlet's soliloquies do something completely different. They do not explain. They do not declare. They argue. Hamlet is, in his soliloquies, in the middle of a conversation with himself that he is, manifestly, losing. He does not know what he thinks. He is finding out as he speaks, by speaking. The thinking is not prepared in advance and then performed. The thinking is happening on the stage, in front of you, in real time. By the end of a soliloquy, Hamlet often holds a different position from the one he held at the start. Look at To Be or Not to Be. The speech is misread, in popular culture, as a meditation on suicide. It is not. It is, more precisely, a meditation on action. Hamlet is asking himself whether it is nobler to act, to take arms against a sea of troubles, in his words, or to suffer the troubles. He is using to be in a particular Shakespearean sense, meaning to do, to act, to take a stand. He is trying to convince himself to do the thing he believes he must do, which is to kill his uncle. He cannot convince himself. By the end of the speech, he has talked himself out of acting on the grounds that thought makes cowards of us all. He has, in 35 lines of verse, performed in front of the audience the exact mechanism by which a person who knows what he should do nonetheless fails to do it. This had never been done before. It was, in 1601, completely new technology. What Shakespeare had invented was the dramatization of the divided mind. Every play before Hamlet had assumed that a character's mind was, in a sense, single. A character might be torn between two duties, but the character's relationship to those duties was direct. Duty was a thing he saw clearly, and he chose between options, and he acted. Hamlet introduced a different model. The mind in Hamlet is internally divided. A part of Hamlet wants to act. Another part of Hamlet is afraid. Another part doubts the evidence. Another part considers the moral implications. Another part performs for an audience inside Hamlet's own head, the argument he is having with himself. The character is not deciding between options the way a chess player decides between moves. The character is fighting himself. This was, in 1601, a recognizable description of how the human mind actually works, but no one had ever managed to put it on a stage before. Most people would not have used such a description even to describe their own minds. The vocabulary did not yet exist. Hamlet provided the vocabulary. After Hamlet, the entire English-speaking world had a way of talking about the divided self that it had not had before. The American critic Harold Bloom made what sounds like an outrageous claim about this, but is, on inspection, simply accurate. He said, Hamlet did not depict a kind of consciousness that existed before he was written. Hamlet created the kind of consciousness that existed after he was written. The play taught its readers, and the readers of every novel written under its influence, how to be a particular kind of self. The introspective, ironical, self-questioning, action-deferring, eloquent about its own paralysis modern self is in many ways a Hamlet-shaped self. It is the kind of self that, before 1601, was uncommon and after 1601, was the default mode of European literary consciousness. Read any major novel of the last 400 years, and you will see it. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment is a Hamlet, a character paralyzed in front of an action he believes he must take, who debates with himself across several hundred pages of internal monologue, who eventually acts, and who then debates the consequences of his action with himself for another 300 pages. Stephen Dedalus in Joyce's novels is a Hamlet. Holden Caulfield is a Hamlet. The narrator of Notes from Underground is a Hamlet stripped of everything except the inner argument. Every literary protagonist who turns the action of the novel inward, who narrates their own consciousness, who finds that the most interesting drama is the drama happening in their head, every such protagonist is, in some sense, a descendant of the Danish prince. This raises a question. If Hamlet is the first character to think the way modern readers think, what was Shakespeare doing in 1601 that allowed him to invent that mode of being? There is no settled answer. There are theories. The most persuasive of them comes from the American Renaissance scholar Stephen Greenblatt, who has spent 20 years arguing that Hamlet was Shakespeare's response to a specific historical crisis. The Reformation had abolished, in Protestant England, the doctrine of purgatory. Before the Reformation, English Catholics had believed that the souls of the dead spent time in purgatory, a state of purification, and that the living could, by prayer and by mass saying, help the dead through it. The dead and the living were in continuous spiritual relationship. The Reformation had cut that connection. There was now no purgatory. The dead were either saved or damned immediately. There was nothing the living could do. This meant that the relationship of every Protestant English subject to the deceased members of their family had become, between roughly 1530 and 1600, deeply strange. The ghost of a dead father had nowhere to be. He could not be in purgatory because there was no purgatory. If he was in heaven, he had no business returning to talk to his son. If he was in hell, he was a devil and could not be trusted. Hamlet opens with exactly this dilemma. A ghost appears. He says he is the prince's dead father. He demands revenge. But Hamlet does not know whether this ghost is what he claims to be, because, in 1601, the official theology of England had no clear place for a ghost. The ghost could be his father. The ghost could be a devil impersonating his father, sent to damn him by tempting him to murder. Hamlet has no way to tell. Greenblatt's argument is that the entire interior crisis of the play, the long delay, the soliloquies, the testing of the ghost's truthfulness by the play within the play comes from the fact that Hamlet has no theological framework that allows him to act. He cannot trust what he has been told. He cannot consult an authority. He cannot pray to the dead. He has to think it through, alone, from scratch. And that thinking it through alone, in 1601, was the new condition of every English Protestant who had lost an authoritative church to mediate their relationship to the unseen world. Shakespeare, on this reading, invented modern interiority because the early modern world had created a kind of person who needed it. What does this mean today? It means that every time you find yourself in an internal argument that you cannot finish, every time you know what you ought to do and find yourself not doing it, every time you watch yourself talking yourself out of an action by introducing one more consideration, one more objection, one more way the situation might be more complicated than you thought, you are in a mode of being that Shakespeare put on a stage at the Globe Theatre in roughly the spring of 1601. Before Hamlet existed as a published text, that mode of being existed as private human experience, but there was no public vocabulary for it, and there was no shared cultural model of how the experience went. After Hamlet, there was. The reason Hamlet is still performed continuously, 400 years later, in every theater in every English-speaking country, and in translation in every theater in the world, is not because the plot is gripping, although it is. It is not because the verse is beautiful, although it is. It is because the central character is doing, on stage, the thing every modern reader does in private. He is failing to act. He is failing to act for reasons he can articulate beautifully. He is articulating his failure as he is failing. And the audience, every audience, in every century since 1601 recognizes itself. That is the only real explanation of why a 400-year-old play about a Danish prince and a poisoned cup and a graveyard scene and a doubtful ghost has not stopped being relevant. Hamlet is us. Or, more accurately, we are him, because he came first. He is the original. If this changed how you think about Hamlet, subscribe. We break down the most important books ever written, one argument at a time. New video every week. And if this was worth 10 minutes of your life, hit like. It helps the channel more than you think.